Rivers are the natural razors that score the aging face of every continent. In the watery cuts and wrinkles can be read not only a history of how they've refashioned the ancient landscape, and of how they in turn are influenced by the rocks they carve, but a forecast of the great changes yet to come, some potentially disastrous to us. Winding toward an ocean, a river is a vigorous, living creature, sweeping old lands away and building new. Most of us know of a local river that has influenced our lives, whose waters we've enjoyed or feared or exploited or wantonly abused. This is the story of such a river, but on a gigantic scale, a story involving the lives of millions of modern Americans. The Chippewa Indians called it the Great River, in their language, Mississippi. This dangerous giant of a river awakens to the scent of pines in the forests of northwestern Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. One lake, called Itasca, trickles over a few leapable gaps to give birth to the playground of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, the Mississippi, whose epic journey will wind 2,350 miles, during which it will fall only 1,500 feet and expand from this timid creek to a 2-mile wide highway and one of the greatest commercial rivers in the world. Perversely, it flows at first northeast, but where does it go then? What other rivers pay tribute to it? How did such a huge river come to be here at all? And why has it gained such notoriety as a restless giant that leaps from its bed to terrorize the heartland of America? In its first great stride of some 500 miles, the Mississippi swings southward, scouring land once burdened with ice. This modern Mississippi playground has only run here for 6,000 years. To geologists, a young channel, a last dribble of the Ice Age. Now holiday homes border the reedy shallows where American Indians once gathered wild rice, a foretaste of the fertility that was to make Minneapolis the richest flour milling city on the river. Already the river has grown powerful, at this point longer than the French River Seine. In the pioneering 1800s, the power was harnessed to saw timber. Today's Minneapolis was yesterday's Fort Snelling, trading post and lumber center, feeding whiskey to the Indians and log cabins to the colonizers of the northern wilderness. The energy for the enterprise surged in St. Anthony's Falls, the Mississippi's first great plunge. A quirk of geology, the falls mark a key change in the underlying land, the start of its next huge stride. The smoke signals of industry speak of a river in the service of people. No longer a shallow wandering stream, the Mississippi, now swollen with the added water of the Minnesota River, will soon become a walled waterway, carving a route between rocky cliffs. The captains of industry looked to these waters to transport their goods to the sea. The Mississippi only became a channel to the Gulf of Mexico by crossing one last geological barrier. Just south of the last reach of the Ice Age glaciers, this commercial highway squeezes between high bluffs of limestone, the folded bed of an ancient sea that arches from underground. Oddly named towboats push great chains of barges through this geological barrier. They are the heavyweight inheritors of a route pioneered by simple rafts that floated perilously one way down the river. A routine run for the young Abraham Lincoln and a rich inspiration for Mark Twain. Both would have marveled at 6,000 horsepower, skillfully pushing 50,000 tons through water 9 feet deep. Mark Twain described it as the crookedest river in the world, since in one part of its journey it used up 1,300 miles to cover the same ground that the crow would fly over in 675. Now the Mississippi is transformed. In from the arid west flows the wide Missouri, a symbolic confluence happening as it does a little above St. Louis, the legendary gateway to the prairies and beyond. From the city that won the West, a steel-arched window looks out to the wagon trails that rolled into the setting sun. But the ever-growing river sweeps on south. Now heavily laden with the dusts of the plains, it meanders lazily, changing course with dangerous ease. Sandy islands build from the slow flow of Mark Twain's "too thick to drink, too thin to plow" river, a process of silting which over millions of years has pushed back the sea to the south and loaded the continent with sediments 3.5 miles thick. As soon as the Ohio River adds its great flood from the east, Huckleberry Finn's monstrous big river can be recognized. It's still the Mississippi, and it keeps on rolling along, down to that jazz-soaked jewel of a southern city, New Orleans. Surprisingly much narrower now, although much deeper, the Mississippi carries the harvests of mid-America out through the second largest seaport in the United States to join the shipping lanes of the Gulf of Mexico. And new cargoes show it's still frontier country. Deceptively, there are still 100 miles to go to reach this marshy delta, the seaward extremity of that great load of sediments that the Mississippi scavenged from an area, it's been said, as great as England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Turkey combined. That measure was Mark Twain's, but what he couldn't know was that now, contrary to what might be expected, the river is building precious little new land. In fact, this delta is sinking quite fast, nearly half an inch every year. Knowing why the land is subsiding may tell us why Old Man River rolls down this way at all. The river and its tributaries drain into the Gulf through a vast basin. The Earth's crust here is unusually thin, and it's slowly sagging under the weight of sediment. How that basin formed is a story that started 600 million years ago. At that time, the world looked different from the one we know today. Continents were drifting across the globe, a slow voyage over millions of years. Movements of the Earth's restless crust sent the land masses we know today as Africa and South America drifting on a collision course with North America. The continents jostled and collided with each other, eventually welding together to form a supercontinent called Pangaea. The restless new mass formed a giant insulating blanket over the Earth's hot interior. As the heat built up beneath Pangaea, the continental crust began to stretch and thin. Eventually, it tore apart. What are called rift valleys grew in several directions, but one began to enlarge much faster. Some rifts, like this one on the left, gradually became inactive and filled with sediments. Called failed rifts, they are weaknesses in the crust and can cause earthquakes. The active rift widened as a further layer of lava was added. More dense than the continental crust, it sank, creating a basin that filled with water, a basin destined to become the North Atlantic Ocean. Further west on this supercontinent, where the Gulf of Mexico would later form, this same process was repeated. Once again, stretching created a new rift. The land to the north, weakened by ancient failed rifts, continued to stretch until the crust became so thin that it shattered, creating a huge shallow sea. The ocean flooded in, covering the continent well inland from today's coastline, drowning the piece of thin sinking crust that would later become the silted floodplain of the Mississippi. Dinosaurs would have witnessed the sea's invasion. As the age of those ruling reptiles drew to a close, the ancient rivers that were to become the Mississippi were reclaiming the lost land, a process that one day the present river would complete. Today there are alligators here, the miniature cousins of that vanished dynasty of reptiles. There were giant turtles, too. As though caught in a time warp, many types of creatures surviving in the Mississippi have been able to retain shapes that compare well with the fossil shadows of their ancestors. After 60 million years, the paddlefish is little changed. It remains a rather feeble plankton hunter. But the sturgeon has lost much of the distinctive armor of its forebears, though it retains a few horny plates along its rather shark-like tail, another shape that would have been well known in that unimaginably distant age. Like vintage automobiles, such fish, including this gar, excite the enthusiast, in this case, of evolution. All these living fish are a direct link to the ancient waters of the Mississippi Basin. And like the Mississippi's ancestors, these mountains further west, the weather-beaten Rockies, are also a product of the birth of the Atlantic. As America moved west, it rode over the floor of the Pacific, thrusting up these jagged peaks. As the continent heaved and buckled, rivers began to wear down the peaks, rivers that would eventually spill eastwards, effectively carrying the mountains as sediments across the plains to join the forerunners of the Mississippi. The Rockies were now a huge mountain range, and a sizable river occupied the Mississippi's present position, but greater changes were to come. Before the recent ice ages, 2 million years ago, most of the rivers on the continent flowed northwards, but the huge ice sheets that swept across North America transformed this drainage. When the last ice sheet withdrew, the river systems had changed completely. The Mississippi was now an enormous river, draining a large part of the continent. It had been lengthened. And in the west, A huge new river, the Missouri, had been added. In the east, the present Ohio River system had been created. And at a place called Cahokia, in the midst of this network of waterways, a prehistoric people realized its potential. This largest of ancient earthworks in North America still stands witness to what some say was a thriving Indian city of 30 to 40,000 people. While Britain faced the Norman conquest, here, what's known as the Mississippian culture existed in towns and villages. Their ancestors had already used these waterways for trade 1,000 years or more. On what's known today as Monk's Mound, there once stood an imposing temple from which, it's suggested, a hierarchy of priest-rulers commanded a community of hunters, farmers, and accomplished craftsmen, whose fine arts and produce were traded across almost a third of the continent. That's the kind of story that's emerging from the detailed excavations on this site. Here they're finding flint drills and other tools made locally. These shells must have been brought here from the Gulf of Mexico and fashioned into beads. And there's other evidence of river commerce 4 centuries before Columbus. This mica could only have come from the distant Appalachian Mountains. And galena, the ore of lead from the north, Illinois and Minnesota. There's copper from Michigan's Isle Royale, and black flint arrowheads from the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. History undoubtedly repeated itself when the Europeans took over the Mississippi heritage, bringing to the land of the canoe that newest marvel of the pioneering age, the steamboat. Few lasted more than 5 years. Their boilers burst. They were holed by tree stumps. They collided, exploded, or just ran aground. Their harassed captains ferried cargoes and scoundrels the length of the waterway. But above all, they were possessed of showboat glamour. The natural hazards facing the first steamboats were trivial, though, compared with the Titanic catastrophe that happened in December 1811. This lake, called Reelfoot, didn't exist before the most gigantic series of earthquakes in the recent history of this continent. Those who survived recalled that at 2 a.m. on Monday, December 16, 1811, not far from New Madrid, close to the river, there was heard a most tremendous noise, equal to the loudest thunder, but more hollow and vibrating, and the air reeked of sulfur. In the first 2 months of 1812, they were to experience 1,874 earthquake shocks, whose effects on the land and the river defied imagination. The river even briefly reversed its flow. Here a fearsome new rapid appeared, a falls down which boats shot like arrows from a bow amid roaring billows and the wildest commotion. Trees were split asunder by gaping fissures. Whole forests were flattened. The town of New Madrid settled 15 feet lower. Miraculously, fatalities in this scattered community were few. The 3 most violent concussions and the shock waves set church bells ringing in Boston and rattled doors in Washington, D.C., over 600 miles away. The Mississippi had been shaken rudely in its bed. Terrifying features of this mammoth convulsion were the sand blows, huge gushers of water and sand that noisily spurted up from a natural deposit 50 feet below this region. The presence of this sand in places lying 3 feet deep and covering many square miles is a reminder of the awesome and, until recently, puzzling event. Why a major earthquake in the center of the continent when most such activity takes place at the edge? In Tennessee, at Memphis State University, just down the river from New Madrid, are just some of the geologists investigating the mystery of what are now called the New Madrid earthquakes. And there's nothing dry or academic about the subject, because every 48 hours or so, this area gives another little twitch, a tremor too small to be felt by most people, but enough to register on this sensitive seismographic equipment. Delicate pens plot the intensity and indicate the location of these mini earthquakes. They're giving us a picture of what's happening underfoot. The earthquake sites mark the path of huge fractures at least 15 miles deep, which run through the Earth's crust. They're now buried about half a mile below the surface by sediments. They form part of what appears to be an enormous failed rift in which the Mississippi now sits. This and a similar structure further west seem to mark the edge of an ancestral North America. They were left after the breakup of a supercontinent that existed before Pangaea. So there's a question now on all our minds. Will a major earthquake happen again, and if so, when? Measuring the size of tremors and noting how often they occur gives the geologist the means of providing answers. The bad news is, yes, it will happen again. The good news is, probably not for another 400 years or more. The earthquake which hit San Francisco in 1906 shook rocks which were young and still soft, so the area of damage was relatively small. But a similar earthquake at New Madrid would shake old, brittle rocks, causing damage over an area 20 times larger. It would affect 12.5 million people. Perhaps it's as well we might have 400 years to prepare. Some 140 miles to the north, the city of St. Louis would feel that dreadful quake. Its buildings are firm on solid bedrock, but would they survive the repeated shocks? Memphis, closer to the site of New Madrid, is even more vulnerable. Parts of the city rest upon the sandy sediments that move and spurt like liquid under shock. The people in this area are thinking hard about what happened in 1812. But even in 1812, memories were short when there was money to be made, and this troubled soil also grew good cotton. From opulent plantations, the steamboats now ferried the wealth of the cotton kings down the river to the world. Today, it's no longer the task of slaves. In the wake of their liberation came the mechanization of the old industry that had begun when we first won our independence. Only an insect has interrupted its progress. The boll weevil once almost stopped the boom, but its depredations were overcome by liberal use of that mixed blessing of an insecticide, DDT. This riverside land has been jealously protected for its rich productivity, but always the river was in control. The simple fact is, the fertile, dark, profitable soil got there because this river floods. And since the Mississippi is a giant of a watercourse, it's prone to floods of biblical proportions. There was practical thinking behind the building of that huge mound at Cahokia. The first European explorers reported that the Indians build their houses on the high land, and here they take refuge. Obviously, little notice was taken of their accounts, and the conquering colonials were washed frequently out of their beds. When the Ice Age plumbed the Missouri and the Ohio River drainage into the Mississippi, snowmelt from the north met rainwater from the east, creating a rampaging monster of a river. In 1927, such a combined disaster cost $364 billion, and that after nearly 200 years battling the brutal Mississippi. The forces that muster to this campaign are the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The ramparts they raise against the river's onslaught are part of the most expensive system of flood control ever devised. The artificial riverbanks are known as levees. In length, they rival the Great Wall of China, but in principle, they echo the simple earthworks of the Indians. This front line of defense not only demands constant vigilance, but is almost self-destructive in that the better the levees confine the river, the faster it flows. A fast river can carry more silt, but that silt can only settle out on the riverbed, in time raising the water to the top of the levee and, on occasion, over. Time and again, between 1880 and 1927, the levees failed, and the unshackled river drowned the towns and plantations. It does happen today, but on a lesser scale since the 1927 cataclysm. Then, 5,000 sandbag-wielding people were swept away by a wall of water 7 feet high, and with a roar as of a mighty wind. It prompted an expensive rethink. The result was the remarkable control scheme that operates today. These are artificial floodways, controlled overflows sending the fury of a flood to spend itself in selected areas with minimum danger to life or livelihood. And here, they're carpeting the banks with concrete, stretching from well above what they hope will be the highest water line to the deepest part of the bed. The mat will fight the undercutting power of the river in full flood. The giant will be caged. An old Mississippi boatman was once heard to say, "There ain't nobody but Uncle Sam as could afford such a river." This revetment machine, as it's called, costs $250,000 to run each day. And machines like this have been carpet laying since 1950. And that's just one weapon in the armory in this relentless battle for the Mississippi Valley. Had the first European explorers realized the task they faced with this swampy river, they might not have been lured by false promises of gold and pearls. There was wealth here, but it was to remain hidden for a couple of centuries more. The monarchs of Europe did see a strategic advantage to this river's exodus, and out of their territorial squabbles grew one of the most exciting cities in the world. The architects of Europe sank their feet in the southern swampland and created New Orleans, a sophisticated city in an immense, soggy wilderness. The city is a monument to human ingenuity, albeit raised on questionable foundations. But so far, the city's motto, "Beneath our wings everything prospers," has held true. It still commands the highway to the interior. But what was not understood when it was founded was that the river maintained the land level of the sinking delta. The river once built new ground with sediments, now held back by the levees. So today, both the delta and parts of the city sink nearly half an inch every year. The The people look up to their pleasure steamboats in every sense, but they're used to living below river level. They haven't yet got that sinking feeling. The lengthy celebration of Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, has become world famous. But the band could be playing while the ship goes down. The delightful city of New Orleans might be one of mankind's major misjudgments of natural continental forces. Live now, pay later has always been the philosophy behind this annual carnival. In earlier days, the citizens paid with their lives as the river periodically flooded them with water and disease. The present taxpayers are still footing the bill, not only to control the river, but, like Venice, to keep their heritage afloat. Once it was depressingly easy to die here, but very difficult to get buried. Gravediggers struck water a shovel's width down, and a heavy downpour was likely to produce an undesirable resurrection. The answer? This white city of high-rise tombs. The city has no architecture, wrote Mark Twain, except that which is found in its cemeteries. As the settling takes its toll, his wit may ring uncomfortably true. In another 200 years, all these buildings may suffer the fate of Fort St. Philip. In 1812, the fort repelled the British fleet, but today it's buried to its battlements in mud. It's a victim of the shackled Mississippi's failure to build up the delta that held back the sea. Where the river still has its freedom, the natural process of building land can still be seen. The break in the river's natural levees is called a crevasse. Through it, the annual spring flood is streaming water and silt out over the land. The sediments settle out, creating enormous mudflats. If this new land is substantial enough to remain above sea level for much of the year, then certain kinds of trees will grow. Their roots will trap more silt, and the land will consolidate further. The result at one time was a Mississippi floodplain the size of Massachusetts. The English explorers thought it a worthless wilderness, hot and humid, a wet grave. The French more poetically perceived it as a floating land. Today there remain just a few tatters of that extraordinary southern beauty. For 30 million years, great rivers built land on the floodplain from the center of the continent south to the Gulf of Mexico. That wealth of trees was cleared by the pioneers to build houses and railroads and to grow crops. What's left is now undergoing profound change. Without an annual covering of silt, swampland sinks, and if the soil becomes too wet, new trees can't grow. It becomes a haven for water plants, one of the most biologically productive communities on Earth. A marsh is born. Close to the sea now, salt water begins to mingle with the fresh. And in the marsh grasses, there comes a foreigner, a nutria. Escapees from a fur farm in 1938, these South Americans have taken over from the local muskrats, which had long been hunted for their fur. The marsh supported so many that in the 1800s, more furs came from here than from Alaska and Canada combined. Now there's a multi-million-dollar price tag on the nutria tail every year. Two and a half times as productive as the average hayfield, this mixed salt and freshwater marsh feeds the excess of its growth down into its own muddy stomach, where countless millions of tiny creatures devour its decay. On this busy world of micro-consumers, a wider economy preys. From here to the sea and to us, a chain of life threads through and beyond the marsh. Oysters lie in wait in the delta, filtering the nutritious fragments missed by a myriad of other creatures. Hiding behind the oyster's grin, a crab plucks its own meal from the oyster-bound flow. And this is a nursery, not only for blue crabs, but for a variety of shrimp and fish. The abundance of fry is an irresistible lure to the resident egrets and herons. While the curved bills of the glossy ibis probe the mud, the roseate spoonbills sift the sediments. It's a communal meal, but the diners each pursue their own delicacies. The good feeding means there's a major north-south migration path up and down the river, the Mississippi Flyway. There aren't quite as many birds as there were in the days of the celebrated artist Audubon. Today's birds run the risk of picking a poisoned meal at times. That's what happened to the brown pelicans. They were secondary victims of that insecticide attack in the 1950s on the boll weevils in the cotton plantations. The excess pesticide washed into the river, was taken by the fish, who later died in millions, but not before the brown pelicans had scooped some up, with fatal results. Within 10 years, one of Louisiana's commonest birds had vanished. The pelicans here now were brought from Florida, and following a ban on the use of DDT and nearly 20 years of careful conservation, they're fishing here again. The lesson was a clear one. This is a shared world, and a careless mistake by us can rebound, not only harming others, but tainting our own harvests from this delta. Almost a third of what the nation takes from the ocean is caught in the Mississippi Delta. By the time it's processed, the annual catch is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Local shrimp have a substantial price on their heads, but without the giant Mississippi salt marshes in which to grow from a tiny drifting larva to an adult as long as your hand, there would be few for the jambalaya or the local filet gumbo. The catch is a cocktail of two kinds, a white and a brown shrimp. They're taken as they migrate from the brackish marsh to the salty open ocean, which they need to spawn. These men are fishing what the Indians called that which enriches the earth. In one word, menhaden. They're small herring-like fishes, but very oily, and someone calculated that there may be 21 billion of them shoaling in this Mississippi Delta. As juveniles, they fed on those millions of mud creatures in the salt marsh. Caught as adults, they'll feed animals and machines. Their oil is an efficient lubricant, and it's used in margarine and for cooking. But without the marsh, they just wouldn't be here in such numbers. It's a short chain from the grass of the delta to this harvestable flesh of the sea. The Gulf of Mexico that accepts this huge river is a rich broth of an ocean, as those ancient seas must have been to produce that other oil that is the foundation of the new wealth under the Mississippi Delta. The oil man cometh. This Louisiana story is a 20th century whirlwind romance between men and black gold that so far they've pursued with 22,000 wells that reach down into history to the oil whose abundance has been influenced by the river. Looked at from space, the Mississippi can be seen pouring plumes of silt into the waiting Gulf, 400 million tons of it in a year. The river slows as it meets the sea and begins to unload its cargo as it has done for millions of years. Close to its mouth, the heaviest component, sand, is deposited. Being coarse, it forms loosely packed sandbars that will eventually turn to sandstone. Further out, finer particles begin to settle. These stick together to form compact, glutinous clays. Where the sediments begin to clear, clouds of microscopic plants develop, nourished by the dissolved nutrients in the river water. As they die and accumulate on the sea floor, a rich mixture of sediments and organic ooze is produced. This is potential oil, if decomposition is prevented by rapid burial or oxygen-deficient water. Rivers loaded with sediment continually build and adjust their courses, so the original deposits are quickly covered by a variety of other layers. The new sediments compress those underneath, and the delta sinks. Over 1,000 feet below, the pressure generates heat. Over millions of years, the sediments change. Clay is compressed and becomes shale, and the organic ooze cooks, forming oil. Droplets of this oil then migrate through the porous sandstone. It's a process that gathers large concentrations of oil, trapping them beneath non-porous shales. 50 years ago, a fortune in oil lay hidden beneath the delta, but the Mississippi covered its tracks so well that the oil was difficult to find. But find it, they did. Louisiana became part of the fuel tank of the United States. From the Mississippi marshes so far, 12 billion barrels of oil and 113 trillion cubic feet of natural gas have been won from the earth. So, how was it found? The answer came with a pinch of salt. In 1901, a geologist called Anthony Lucas, looking for salt, struck oil and gas when he drilled into one or two rather special low hills in the delta. One such hill, called Avery Island, sits like a low iceberg in the marsh. It was well known to local Indians as a place to collect rock salt. The mound was almost all pure salt. Geologists today call such formations salt domes, and oil is often found alongside them. Companies looking for salt found more than a pinch, and those seeking oil found more than anyone would have believed. The origin of both lay in the ancient seas. At about the time the Gulf of Mexico began to form, enormous briny lagoons filled the developing basin. In the hot climate, evaporation reduced the shallow sea to thick deposits of salt. It seems that the sea washed across the subsiding basin many times, each flood adding its own contribution until the basin was completely filled with salt. Its presence is not obvious today because it's covered with limestone and buried beneath 6 miles of other sediments. Salt has a lower density than the overlying rocks. Under pressure, it behaves like a fluid, so it rises up through the rocks. As it pushes upwards, it bends the overlying strata. Oil also tends to flow upwards, so it eventually collects around the salt. If a salt dome can be located, it's relatively easy to find the oil. What was not always so easy was to find the salt dome. Most of them don't break the flat surface of the marsh. The story of the subsequent hunt for the 300 or so hidden salt domes is written on the marsh itself. The tractor-like marsh buggies were no respecters of this environment. In their ignorance, the prospectors left a permanent record of their quest for oil, tracks that in places are eroding into open water. The first step was to dig a canal, to take in the oil rig and supply it. Now there are some 12,000 miles of supply canals and a number of much larger shipping canals that allow easier transport along the coast and to and from the sea. What that's really done is to destroy the marsh. The canals allowed ocean water to flood in on the tide. The excess salt killed many of the marsh grasses, the plants whose roots held the land together. The dredged mud blocks the drainage, preventing toxic substances, natural and artificial, from washing away to the sea, and that, too, killed the plant life. Quite simply, Louisiana's already tattered wetlands are beginning to fall apart ever more rapidly. But although this area resembles a battlefield, death and destruction are not new events on the Delta. 50 years of geological study have revealed that similar changes have happened many times in the past. Changes wrought not by us, but by the fickle Mississippi itself. "5,000 years ago, the river's delta was further west in this Atchafalaya Basin. Lands to the east, no longer receiving silt, subsided. And into this lowered ground, the river diverted, creating a new delta. Periodic diversions happened at intervals of about 1,000 years. It seems that the river has held its present course for nearly that length of time. But the steepest route to the sea is now the well-subsided Atchafalaya Basin, and the Mississippi is about to move west once again. For the first time in its history, this impatient river finds its natural way blocked. 200 miles upstream from New Orleans, at the point where the switch of direction ought to happen, a barrier of concrete is so far saying no to the mighty Mississippi. But how did this confrontation arise? It really goes back to when the Mississippi took over a part of the Red River and created a new meander. The bank of the meander later collapsed, creating a small stream, the Atchafalaya, which drained water off into the swamps. In 1831, a steamboat captain cut a canal across the meander to improve navigation. The river quickly accepted the new shortcut, and the upper part of the old channel soon silted up. The lower part remained open and came to be called the Old River. The Red River now began to move into the Atchafalaya, but a massive log jam at its head restricted the flow. This was removed in 1839 to open the Atchafalaya for navigation, but unwittingly, this provided the Mississippi with a shorter and steeper route to the sea, threatening to divert the entire Mississippi away from New Orleans. To prevent such an economic and social disaster, a lock and dam were built across the old river. Upstream, a new channel was dug, and a further control built, allowing some water to flow west, but keeping the Mississippi on course. This is the giant tap on which the future of New Orleans and the city of Baton Rouge, just 60 miles below this control point, depend. It's a controversial construction that's given good value for its $60 million cost, but has had its problems. When only 10 years old, in 1973, a fearsome flood brought about the collapse of one of the curved wing walls designed to prevent eddies undermining the structure. This gigantic rock pile was the emergency answer then to prevent disaster. But Old Man River goes on battering at the door to the Atchafalaya Basin. The men from the Army Corps of Engineers know they face the fight of their lives. At least 5 times a week, they check the depth of the water in the new channel just in case the Mississippi starts to burrow under the concrete.
145!
It's tough, dangerous, but essential work if a major disaster is to be prevented. One day, the wheel of fortune may turn against them. But if the Mississippi does change course, then this old lower stretch of the highway to New Orleans will become a salty and silted-up estuary of the Gulf of Mexico. Bad news for the multi-billion-dollar refineries that line its banks. Between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, the Mississippi is an industrial corridor. Petrochemical industries need fresh water. The influx of the sea would be comparable to adding sand to a gearbox. To delay that fateful day when ships can no longer navigate and New Orleans has to make alternative arrangements for its drinking water, several $1 million have been poured into the concrete of a new control just south of the old. An emergency tap, but one which some engineers fear will only enlarge the scale of the disaster when it finally happens. All eyes are on the Atchafalaya River. For over a century it's been changing. It now inherits nearly a third of the Mississippi's flow and a good deal of its heavy mid-American silt. A new delta is being born, a birth attended by much interest, not all of it geological. After all, it could turn into valuable real estate. The first of these delta islands emerged after the 1973 floods, and they've persisted, pioneered by plants and hosts of small animals. The delta grows in leaps and bounds, encouraged by the flood every spring. Slowly, a great relocation of Louisiana wildlife is underway, as though the new delta is preparing for the day the Mississippi rolls this way again. The days of the present delta are naturally numbered, but our temperings have tipped the balance further in favor of the encroaching sea. These deserted coastal defenses remain as a measure of our own mistakes. Change is in the air along this whole coast. 50 square miles of land are washed away every year. The taming of a mighty river is not without its price. If present trends continue, not only will this coastal strip sink beneath the waves, but the city of New Orleans could find the tide sweeping its doorstep. Quite simply, now there is no longer just a fight against the river. There's a battle with the ocean, too. A battle that can only be won by unleashing the full power of the river, so new land can be built that will hold back the sea. The certainty is There's no retreat from this reshaping of the continent, a process these offshore remnants of ancient deltas tell us has happened so many thousand times before.